An avoidant does not fall in love the way most people do. They fall into a fantasy long before they fall into a bond. And if you do not understand this, you will always feel like you are chasing someone who is emotionally half present and mentally elsewhere. Because the avoidant mind is not driven by closeness, but by imagination, by the idea of connection without the weight of it, by desire without obligation, and by intimacy that never fully traps them. And the biggest mistake people make with avoidance is trying to pull them into reality too quickly, demanding clarity, consistency, reassurance, or emotional depth before the avoidant has decided that staying is safer than leaving. Because to an avoidant, love is not comfort, love is threat, and fantasy is protection. They stay where they can want you without losing themselves, where they can miss you without being responsible for you, where they can idealize you without having to show up every day. And this is where most people unknowingly push them away, by trying to turn potential into permanence, before the avoidant is ready to believe permanence will not destroy them. So if you want to understand why avoidants suddenly disappear, why they pull away right when things feel good, why they sabotage connection after intimacy, you have to understand this one truth. Avoidants do not fear you. They fear the version of themselves they become when they are needed. Because need means dependence. And dependence means loss of control. And loss of control feels like emotional death to someone who learned early that relying on others leads to disappointment, abandonment, or suffocation. So instead of craving reassurance, they crave freedom wrapped in desire. They crave someone who feels emotionally warm, but not emotionally demanding. Someone who feels deep but not heavy. Someone who feels special without making them feel trapped. And when you unknowingly chase an avoidant, explain your feelings, seek validation, or try to lock in commitment through pressure, you shatter the fantasy that made them feel safe enough to stay interested in the first place. Because the fantasy was never about being needed. It was about being chosen, freely, without force, without obligation, without emotional debt. And this is why avoidants are obsessed with the idea of the unavailable lover, the independent partner, the emotionally grounded person who does not collapse when they pull away, because that person allows them to desire without panic, to attach without feeling consumed, and to imagine a future without feeling cornered. And when you play to this fantasy unintentionally, by living fully, by not centering your emotional world around them, by having boundaries that do not beg to be crossed, you become magnetic to the avoidant psyche. Because you represent connection without captivity, intimacy without loss of self, and love without chains. And the avoidant begins to associate you with emotional safety, rather than emotional demand, which is the only environment in which they can slowly move closer. But the moment you try to secure them through control or constant availability, you activate their deepest survival instinct, which is to escape before they are engulfed. And they will rationalize their withdrawal by telling themselves they are not ready, you are too much, the timing is wrong, or the connection is flawed. When in reality what scared them was not the relationship, but the pressure to become someone they do not yet feel safe being. And the reason playing to their fantasy works is not manipulation, it is alignment. Because the fantasy is not about games. It is about emotional pacing. About allowing desire to breathe, instead of suffocating it with urgency. And when you stop chasing clarity and start embodying emotional stability, when you stop asking where you stand and start standing firmly in who you are, something shifts inside the avoidant. Because now they are the one leaning forward, now they are the one wondering. Now they are the one feeling the pull without the panic. And this is where attachment begins for them. Quietly, internally, without dramatic declarations, without sudden promises, but through a growing realization that being close to you does not cost them their freedom, their identity, or their sense of control. And once an avoidant feels that staying does not equal losing themselves, they stop fantasizing about leaving. Because the fantasy has become real in the safest possible way, and that is when they choose to remain. Not because they were convinced, pressured, or chased, but because they finally experienced connection without fear, which is the only kind of love an avoidant can learn to trust. Once the avoidant begins to feel that your presence does not threaten their autonomy, a deeper internal shift starts to occur. One that most people never witness, because it happens silently and internally rather than through words or actions. And this is where most connections either stabilize or completely fall apart. Because this phase requires patience, emotional discipline, and a strong sense of self that does not rely on the avoidant's validation to survive. And what happens next is not romantic in the traditional sense. It is psychological. The avoidant starts testing whether the fantasy can survive reality, whether the image they created of you is safe, independent, and emotionally self-contained is consistent over time. And they do this not by asking questions but by pulling back, by becoming inconsistent, by delaying responses, by creating emotional distance just enough to see if you collapse, chase, or panic. Because in their mind emotional collapse equals danger, and emotional stability equals safety. And this is where people unknowingly fail. Because they interpret the pullback as rejection, and respond with increased effort, more availability, more emotional exposure, more reassurance seeking, which feels logical to someone who bonds through closeness. But to an avoidant it feels like proof that intimacy will eventually trap them. And the moment they sense that you need their presence to feel secure, the fantasy begins to crack. Because now love feels like responsibility. And responsibility feels like a loss of freedom. So the avoidant distances further. Not because they stopped caring, but because they are trying to regulate their fear without knowing how to communicate it. And if you understand this stage properly, you stop reacting and start observing. You allow space without resentment. You remain warm without becoming available on demand. You continue living your life fully, without making them the emotional center of it. And this is where the avoidant becomes confused in a way they cannot explain. Because their usual strategy stops working. The distance does not make you chase. The silence does not make you beg. The withdrawal does not make you disappear emotionally, or turn cold. And now they are forced to sit with a feeling they are not used to, which is desire without control. And this discomfort slowly transforms into attachment. Because attachment for an avoidant is not created through reassurance but through emotional contrast. Through realizing that you remain grounded whether they are close or far. That your sense of self does not rise and fall with their attention. And this makes you emotionally irreplaceable. Because now they associate you with calm rather than chaos, with steadiness rather than pressure, and with choice rather than obligation. And this is the moment when the avoidant begins to move toward you on their own terms. Not dramatically, not verbally, but through subtle behaviors like checking in more often, staying longer, opening up unexpectedly, or showing concern they never showed before. And if you respond to this shift with desperation or immediate emotional demands, you undo the progress. Because the avoidant needs to feel that closeness is optional, not required, that intimacy is welcomed, not expected, and that love does not come with hidden costs. And when you allow this slow rhythm to exist without trying to accelerate it, something rare happens. The avoidant starts integrating you into their internal world, rather than keeping you as a distant fantasy. And this integration is terrifying for them, because it means you now matter. And when someone matters, they have the power to hurt you. And avoidants learned early that being hurt is something to avoid at all costs, so they may still retreat at times, still question their feelings, still intellectualize the connection, but now the difference is that they come back. Because leaving no longer brings relief. It brings loss. And this is the point where the fantasy evolves. It is no longer about escape. It is about continuity. About imagining a future that does not feel like a prison. And the reason this works is not because you played a role or followed a tactic, but because you became emotionally safe by not abandoning yourself to keep them. And this is the paradox of avoidant attachment. The more you hold yourself, the more they can hold you. The more you respect your boundaries, the safer they feel approaching you. And the more you stop trying to be chosen, the more they choose you freely. And at this stage, the avoidant is not staying because they are afraid to leave. They are staying because leaving feels emptier than remaining. And that is a profound shift. Because it means you are no longer just a fantasy. You are a secure emotional reference point. And once an avoidant experiences that kind of connection, they rarely forget it. Even if the relationship ends. Because you showed them a version of love that did not demand self-erasure, and that experience reshapes how they attach forever. And this is why playing to the avoidance fantasy is never about manipulation or control. It is about understanding the emotional language they were forced to learn to survive, and choosing not to fight it, but to meet it with self-respect, emotional maturity, and inner stability. Because when an avoidant finally realizes that being with you does not cost them their freedom, they stop fantasizing about escape, and instead they start fantasizing about staying, quietly, deeply, and for the first time without fear.